It began long before the Pacific turned red with fire. In the late 1930s, two nations, a world apart, were quietly sketching the future of air combat. One relied on numbers and industry, the other on spirit and precision. Both were racing to build the perfect fighter. In California, engineers at Lockheed were chasing a dream so ambitious that even the Army Air Corps thought it was madness. They called it the Model 22, an aircraft that looked more like something from science fiction than from any airfield of its time. It had two engines mounted on twin booms, a central cockpit pod, and a sleek, almost menacing profile. It was the first American fighter designed to climb faster than any enemy, fly higher than any bomber, and dive so fast that air itself seemed to scream against its wings. When the prototype finally took shape, someone remarked that it looked like two airplanes trying to fly at once. But what rolled out of the Lockheed plant in 1939 wasn't just another aircraft, it was a new idea. America would call it the P-38 Lightning. Across the Pacific, the story was unfolding very differently. Japan, isolated by geography but driven by ambition, was pursuing an entirely opposite vision. Where Lockheed sought power and range through complexity, the Imperial Navy demanded simplicity and purity of flight. Their leading designer, Jiro Horikoshi, believed that the key to victory lay in a pilot's touch, not the machine's armor. His mission: build the lightest, most agile fighter the world had ever seen. Every ounce mattered. Armor removed. Self-sealing fuel tanks? Too heavy. Instead, Horikoshi focused on balance, sensitivity, and reach. The result was the A6M0, a fragile masterpiece that could outturn, outclimb, and outfly anything in the sky. It was a bird made for aces, not survivors. When Japan unleashed the Zero over China and later across the Pacific in 1940, the world was stunned. American pilots who tried to dogfight it never came back. It could pivot inside their turns, rise effortlessly in a spiral, and stay airborne for hours, its range unmatched by anything the Allies had. To many, it seemed almost supernatural, a phantom that danced through bullets. Meanwhile, back in America, Lockheed's engineers were facing their own set of nightmares. The P-38's twin Allison engines were powerful but temperamental. Compressibility, an aerodynamic phenomenon few understood at the time, made dives dangerous. Pilots reported losing control as the plane approached speeds near Mach 0.7. For a moment, the dream of the Lightning looked doomed. But while the Zero was born of intuition, the Lightning was forged through innovation. Lockheed didn't give up. They experimented, reinforced the airframe, and taught pilots how to use dive recovery flaps. Every problem solved made the Lightning tougher, smarter, deadlier. By the time the US entered the war after Pearl Harbor, both fighters had matured, but in completely different ways. The Zero was a duelist's blade, elegant and deadly in the hands of a master. The P-38 was a warhammer heavy, loud, and built for endurance. They were destined to meet because each embodied its nation's soul. For the Americans, the Lightning represented industrial might, the idea that innovation could overcome anything. For the Japanese, the Zero embodied Bushido, the belief that skill and sacrifice could defy even the odds of nature itself. What neither side yet realized was that the skies of the Pacific would soon become the proving ground for those two philosophies. And when they met, the duels would not just decide the fate of aircraft, they would shape the very future of air combat. As 1942 dawned, both fighters were ready, but only one would adapt to the war that was coming. When the war erupted across the Pacific in late 1940, the United States found itself outmatched, outmaneuvered, and outflown. American pilots went up in outdated P-40 and P-39, and many never came back. The Zero dominated the skies, with ghost-like graysets, pilots turning circles around heavier Allied aircraft. To the men on the ground, it felt like Japan had found a secret the rest of the world didn't understand. And then, from across the ocean, came something entirely different, something that looked nothing like a fighter at all, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. 2 engines, twin tails, and a cockpit that seemed to float in the center. It looked alien, as if it had fallen from the future into a world still fighting the past. At first, the P-38 was sent to Europe, but the Pacific soon became its true testing ground. Its long range made it one of the few aircraft capable of spanning the endless ocean distances between island bases. But when it arrived in the sweltering jungles of New Guinea and the Solomon Islands in 1942, the Lightning met an enemy just as fierce as the Zero, the environment itself. Engines overheated. Oil boiled on the tarmac. Mechanics worked with sweat pouring off their backs, swatting mosquitoes while patching holes with whatever they could find. The tropical climate corroded everything: wires, guns, morale. The Lightning, born in the clean, dry air of California, wasn't built for this hell. Pilots complained the engines would seize during takeoff. The constant humidity warped instruments, and jungle dust clogged radiators. But even in this nightmare, something extraordinary began to happen. The P-38 pilots, young, brash, and inventive, started to learn how to fight differently. One of them was Richard Bong, a quiet farm boy from Wisconsin who would later become America's top ace. He didn't have the ego of a showman, but he had something rarer: patience. He studied how the Zero moved, how it turned tighter, climbed slower, but lost speed in dives. He learned to use the Lightning's weight as a weapon. "Don't turn with them," he told new pilots. "Dive, fire, and climb away. Make them chase what they can't catch." The P-38's speed in a dive was unmatched. While a Zero could twist and roll like a dancer, it couldn't follow the Lightning into a steep plunge without tearing its fragile wings apart. In those few seconds of advantage, the P-38 could line up its 4 .50 caliber machine guns and single 20mm cannonball mounted in the nose and unleash a devastating burst of fire. No deflection angles, no guesswork, just raw precision. Still, early on, many Lightning pilots died learning those lessons the hard way. Some underestimated the Zero's ability to roll at low speeds, others tried to dogfight and paid the price. Reports from the field told grim stories: P-38 seconds ambushed at dawn, engines sputtering, fuel running dry over open ocean. But every failure was a step toward mastery. By 1943, the Lightning's pilots began turning the tide. The long-range escort missions over the Solomon Islands became legendary. The P-38's ability to fly hundreds of miles farther than other fighters meant it could protect bombers where no one else could. It became the first true long-range escort fighter of the Pacific. And then came an unexpected teacher: Charles Lindbergh. Though officially a civilian advisor, Lindbergh traveled to the Pacific to help pilots squeeze every ounce of range from their engines. He taught them delicate fuel management techniques, how to fly lean, how to stretch a tank until it seemed impossible. His lessons gave the P-38 even greater reach, allowing it to strike deep into enemy territory and return safely. But for all its strength, the Lightning's pilots still feared one thing: the Zero's ambush. Japanese airmen used clouds and sun glare to appear out of nowhere. In those moments, the dogfight would erupt into a chaos of spiraling contrails and tracer fire, where survival came down to instinct. To win, the Americans had to think beyond instinct. They had to think like engineers in the sky. They started using teamwork. Wingmen flew in pairs, covering each other's blind spots. Radios became as deadly as guns, with pilots coordinating ambushes of their own. Every engagement became a chess match of speed, altitude, and timing. The Zero still ruled the turning fight. The P-38 owned the dive. But the war wasn't decided in one maneuver, it was decided in adaptation, and the Lightning, like the country that built it, learned faster than anyone expected. Soon, those long silver wings became a symbol to both sides. To Americans, it was the bird that finally fought back. To Japanese pilots, it was the shadow that meant the hunter had become the hunted. And before long, that shadow would strike at the very heart of the empire itself. To understand why the P-38's arrival was such a turning point, you have to step into the cockpit of the Zero and feel what it was like to fly it. Because for all its fragility, for all the myths that would one day surround it, the A6M Zero was not built to survive. It was built to win. When Japanese naval pilots first climbed into the Zero, they described it as an extension of the body, not a machine. Its controls were feather-light, responsive to the slightest movement. You didn't force it, you guided it, as if you were pulling it through air made of silk. From the moment the wheels left the runway, the plane became something alive. The Zero could outturn any Allied fighter in the early years of the war. In the right hands, it could make impossible maneuvers look effortless, climbing vertically into the sun, rolling into a tight corkscrew, or pulling a sudden high G-loop that left opponents guessing. Pilots like Saburo Sakai and Hiroyoshi Nishizawa turned these movements into art forms, their duels more like aerial sword fights than mechanical combat. But the Zero's true weapon wasn't just agility, it was reach. It could fly more than 1,500 miles without refueling, a distance the P-42s and Wildcats could only dream of. That range meant Japanese carriers could launch devastating surprise attacks across the Pacific. It's what allowed the strikes on Pearl Harbor, the lightning raids on the Philippines, and the sweeping domination over the South Pacific in early 1942. Behind that range, however, was a dangerous trade-off. To achieve such lightness, the Zero had no armor behind the pilot's seat, no self-sealing fuel tanks, no bulletproof glass. Every pound saved in protection went into range and maneuverability. It was a flying scalpel, deadly in the right hands, suicidal in the wrong ones. In combat, this philosophy worked beautifully at first. American pilots, trained in heavier, slower aircraft, tried to fight the Zero the same way they fought Germans in Europe. Tight turns, close dogfights, brute endurance. Against the Zero, that was suicide. Japanese pilots cut them apart with surgical precision, rolling behind them and filling their canopies with glowing orange tracers. Reports began to spread among Allied air units. Never turn with a Zero. They can loop tighter than you think, hit once and they explode. The myth of the invincible Japanese fighter was born not just from fear, but from misunderstanding. The Zero wasn't unbeatable. It was simply unmatched at what it was built to do. Japanese training also gave the Zero its edge. Every Imperial Navy pilot was a product of brutal discipline. Out of thousands of trainees, only a few ever earned their wings. They practiced until muscle memory replaced, thought flying in formations so tight that the wings nearly touched. Their instructors taught them to fight with calm precision, to value instinct and intuition as much as tactics. Many had already seen combat in China before Pearl Harbor. They were battle-hardened veterans, while most Allied pilots were rookies fresh from flight school. It wasn't just skill, it was psychology. The Japanese pilots believed they were warriors of the sky, bound by Bushidothi code of honor that valued death over defeat. To them, surrender was unthinkable. Every mission was a final mission. They believed their sacrifice elevated the empire, and that belief gave them a cold, almost supernatural calm under fire. Allied pilots called it the eyes of men who didn't care if they came back. But hidden within that calm was the Zero's fatal weakness: rigidity. As the war went on, Japan couldn't replace its veteran pilots fast enough. The brutal training pipeline that had produced its early aces was too slow. When those masters fell, they were replaced by young men with half their experience and none of their survival instincts. And the Zero, despite its beauty, was not forgiving to inexperience. It demanded finesse. One mistake, One overpulled turn, and its delicate airframe would snap like glass. Meanwhile, the Americans were learning. Each battle that ended in loss was studied, diagrammed, and turned into a lesson. By mid-1943, U.S. intelligence had captured and rebuilt a Zero that had crash-landed on Akutan Island in the Aleutians. Engineers examined every rivet, every bolt, every weakness. They found the flaws, its sluggish roll rate at high speeds, its inability to dive fast without losing control, and its fragile construction. Those discoveries changed everything. New tactics were born: boom and zoom. Don't turn, dive. Attack from above, never below. What had once been a terror became a target. The Zero, once the hunter, was slowly becoming the hunted. Still, the legend of the Zero didn't fade easily. Even as American aircraft began to catch up, 4U Corsairs, P-40 Warhawks, and the P-38s there remained a quiet respect, even fear, among Allied pilots. They knew the plane's weaknesses, but they also knew that in the hands of a skilled Japanese ace, the Zero could still perform miracles. It could still kill. And before long, both aircraft, the Zero and the Lightning, would face each other in the most precise, daring, and controversial interception of the entire Pacific War. It wouldn't happen over a base or a carrier. It would happen in the middle of nowhere, over the dark jungles of Bougainville, where America's twin-engine giant would set out to kill Japan's greatest admiral. It was April 18th, 1943. A humid morning over Bougainville, thick with low clouds and the heavy silence that comes before violence. At a remote American base on Guadalcanal, a squadron of P-38 Lightnings waited on the tarmac. Their mission had been stamped top secret. Only the commanding officers knew the full truth. This wasn't a patrol, it was an assassination. Their target, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the mastermind behind Pearl Harbor. Days earlier, American codebreakers had intercepted a Japanese transmission. It was routine travel information except for one line. Yamamoto himself would be inspecting forward bases in the Solomon Islands. He would arrive in a twin-engine bomber at precisely 9:45 a.m., escorted by Zero fighters. The message included the exact route, altitude, and timing. It was the kind of intelligence generals dream about, a chance to strike at the very heart of Japan's war machine. But there was a catch. The target lay 400 miles away, well beyond the range of any American fighter except one, the P-38 Lightning. The mission that followed would test not just technology, but courage, secrecy, and precision, unlike anything attempted before. The men chosen to carry it out were told in no uncertain terms, "If you are shot down, no one will know why you were there." Major John W. Mitchell, commander of the 339th Fighter Squadron, led the team. 18 P-38 seconds were selected for the job, 4 of them killers, tasked with intercepting Yamamoto's bomber formation, and the rest serving as top cover. Each plane was stripped of all unnecessary equipment and fitted with long-range drop tanks. The flight plan was a masterpiece of calculation: fly low, no higher than 50 feet above the wavestow, stay beneath Japanese radar, navigate hundreds of miles by dead reckoning, hit the target to the minute, and escape before reinforcements could arrive. At 7 a.m., engines roared to life. The Lightnings lifted from the runway in pairs, their silver bodies skimming the ocean, engines humming in eerie unison. For nearly 2 hours they flew just above the sea, pilots watching waves whip beneath their wings, nerves taut as piano wire. They couldn't use radios. One wrong heading by a single degree, and they'd miss the target completely, or crash into the jungle. But luck, or perhaps fate, was with them. At exactly 9:34 a.m., one of the pilots, Lieutenant Rex Barber, spotted black dots rising from the horizon, a formation of twin-engine Betty bombers escorted by Zeros. The timing was perfect. Yamamoto was right on schedule. Mitchell gave the order, "Go!" The P-38 seconds climbed sharply from sea level, engines howling. The Japanese formation never saw them coming. Within seconds, the sky exploded into chaos traces, cannon fire, smoke trails weaving through the morning haze. Two lightnings, flown by Barber and Lutain. Thomas Lanphier dove straight for the lead bomber. Barber fired first, long bursts of .50 caliber slugs tearing into the Betty's left engine. Flames erupted. Moments later, Lanphier cut across its nose and unleashed another burst. The bomber shuddered, rolled onto its side, and plunged into the jungle below. Inside that aircraft was Admiral Yamamoto. Witnesses said the wreckage was found deep in the forest, the admiral still seated upright, his white gloves unburned, a bullet through his chest. He had died instantly. The second bomber tried to flee, chased by Barber, who riddled it with fire until it too crashed into the trees. The Zeros, caught off guard, scrambled to retaliate, but were outnumbered and disorganized. The entire battle lasted barely 10 minutes. When the P-38 seconds returned to base, they landed in silence. No cheers, no celebration. The mission was so secret that even their fellow airmen didn't know where they'd been. Officially, it was classified routine patrol. Only days later did word leak out, and when it did, the effect rippled across the world. In Japan, shock and mourning. The nation's most revered naval commander, the architect of its early victories, was gone. Morale plunged. For many Japanese officers, it was as if the spirit of their empire had been cut down mid-flight. In America, the mission became legend. It proved the value of intelligence, precision, and the reach of the P-38 Lightning. Newspapers called it the longest fighter interception in history. Pilots called it something else, a miracle of timing and courage. But behind the headlines, controversy brewed. Who fired the fatal shot, Barber or Lanphier? Both claimed credit. For decades, historians argued over whose burst brought down Yamamoto's plane. Film footage was inconclusive, witness accounts conflicted. Even today, the question remains unsettled, a shadowy dispute inside one of the most decisive moments of the Pacific War. What no one could dispute, however, was the result. The Japanese Navy lost not only its greatest strategist, but its faith in invulnerability, and the Americans gained something even more valuable, a sense of destiny. The P-38 had done what no other fighter could. It had reached across the ocean, struck the heart of the enemy, and returned. From that day forward, the Zero would never again fly without fear. The hunter had become the hunted, but as the P-38's legend grew, so did the challenges ahead. The war was shifting, the enemy adapting, and soon the Lightning would face a deadlier test, not of skill, but of endurance. By the summer of 1943, the Pacific skies had changed. The war that once seemed like Japan's to command was slipping from its grasp. The Zero was still fast, still graceful, but its age was showing. And the P-38 Lightning, once dismissed as too complex for combat, had become the spearhead of America's expanding air power. But superiority wasn't just about machines anymore, it was about how they were flown. In those early duels, American pilots had learned the hard way that courage wasn't enough. The Zero still turned tighter, still climbed better at low speeds. Pilots who forgot that, who tried to match it, turn for turn vanished in puffs of smoke. Yet the ones who adapted, who used the Lightning's strengths instead of fighting on the enemy's terms, began to dominate the skies. "Altitude is life insurance," one pilot said. It became the mantra of the Pacific. The P-38's secret lay in its power. Two Allison engines, each with a turbo supercharger, allowed it to climb higher and faster than any Zero. In thin air, where Japanese planes struggled to breathe, the Lightning thrived. American pilots started hunting from above, diving like hawks, firing quick and climbing away before the Zero could even turn. It was war reduced to geometry, angles, energy, and seconds. Japanese pilots called the tactic boom and zoom. At first, they thought it was cowardice, Americans refusing to fight honorably, but soon they realized it was science, not fear. The lightning didn't need to dance, it only needed one strike. Dogfights over New Guinea and the Solomon Islands became laboratories of aerial evolution. The sky filled with contrails curling like white scars above the jungle. Every engagement taught new lessons. One P-38 pilot described it perfectly. We learned to fight the Zero the way a boxer fights a knife, and never step into the blade. To the Japanese, the change was unsettling. They were facing an enemy that no longer played by their rules. The Americans used radios to coordinate formations, a luxury the Japanese still lacked. The Lightning's pilots could call out positions, set traps, and turn the chaos of air combat into something like a synchronized ballet of death. One mission over the Solomon Islands became a textbook example. A group of Japanese bombers escorted by Zeros spotted what they thought were slow American aircraft far below. They dove for the kill only to realize too late that the bait was a trap. A squadron of P-38 seconds streaked in from above, diving at over 400 miles per hour. In seconds, 4 Zeros were torn apart before they could even react. The survivors fled toward the clouds, their formations shattered, but the Lightning wasn't invincible. Its size and complexity meant any damage could cripple it. In the brutal humidity, engines overheated and radiators failed. When one engine died, a pilot had to wrestle the aircraft home on the other, sometimes for hours, alone, over open ocean. More than a few vanished into the sea without a Tracino wreckage, no signal, just silence. Still, the balance of power was shifting. The Americans now controlled the tempo of battle. Their pilots had learned to think like tacticians, not just fighters. They studied patterns, memorized Zero weaknesses, and learned to use speed and surprise as weapons. When the Japanese turned left, the Americans dove right. When they feinted, the P-38 seconds climbed. It became a chess match at 20,000 feet where hesitation meant death. The Lightning's improved variants, especially the P-38 duels and L models, added even more power. Better cooling, reinforced wings, and boosted engines gave it the edge it needed to outclimb and outgun anything Japan could field. Its 5 nose-mounted guns created a stream of fire so concentrated that even a short burst could tear a Zero apart. By late 1943, the duels that once ended in panic for American pilots now ended in calm efficiency. Richard Bong, the quiet ace from Wisconsin, had become a legend. His kill count rose to 40. His friend and rival, Thomas Maguire, was close behind. The two men represented everything the P-38 had become: precision, patience, and controlled aggression. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation wasn't in the machines, it was in the mindset. The Americans no longer feared the Zero, they respected it, and that respect made them deadlier than ever. Each encounter became personal. Many pilots later said they could recognize Japanese aces by their flying styles, the way one rolled, the way another climbed. It was as if every duel carried an unspoken conversation: skill versus adaptation, instinct versus innovation. Yet even as the Lightning reigned supreme, the war itself was evolving faster than any airplane. Japan's industrial heart was crumbling. Its fuel supplies were collapsing. The Imperial Navy's carrier Group Sons, the terror of the Pacific, were bleeding to death. The sky was becoming an American domain. Still, for the men who flew these duels, victory came with a strange kind of melancholy. They had outsmarted their enemy, but in doing so, they had killed men who fought with impossible courage. And as the Lightning's contrails spread across the Pacific, another kind of battle was beginning, one that wouldn't be fought with bullets, but with willpower and belief. Because, while the Americans fought to survive, the Japanese pilots fought for something they no longer believed they could win. By 1944, the Pacific Air War had become something more than a clash of machines. It had become a battle of minds. The P-38 Lightning and the Zero still met over the same coral islands and jungled ridges, but now, beneath every duel, there was something deeper: fear, exhaustion, pride, and a growing awareness that the war's outcome had already begun to tilt toward one side. For Japanese pilots, the change was almost spiritual. They had grown up believing in invincibility. The early victories at Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, and Singapore had taught them that their training, their spirit, and their aircraft were unmatched. But now, that belief was being torn apart one mission at a time. They would take off from runways carved into jungle clearings, knowing the odds were stacked against them. The airfields that once hummed with confidence now echoed with quiet resignation. A Zero pilot named Tetsuzo Iwamoto once wrote in his diary, "I climb into the sky and feel the eyes of 1,000 dead comrades watching. We were taught to win or die, but what happens when there is no victory left?" That line captured the psychology of an entire generation, men who fought as if their deaths could slow history itself. On the American side, the mindset was different, cooler, but not without emotion. The Lightning pilots had come to respect their opponents almost to the point of reverence. Many admitted, after the war, that they had admired the skill and composure of Japanese aviators. "They were good," said Richard Bong. "Dim good, you could never relax. You never assumed you had them beat, not until the smoke came out." The P-38 gave its pilots confidence, but not arrogance. It was a machine that demanded discipline. With 2 engines, 4 machine guns, and a cannon, it was powerful, but only if used wisely. It was not a plane for showboating. Pilots who got cocky often didn't come back. That made the Lightning's men methodical, careful, and professional, something their Japanese adversaries came to notice. There were moments, amid all the death, when respect crossed enemy lines. In one encounter over Rabaul, a P-38 pilot named Bill Harris shot down a Zero that had just destroyed one of his squadron mates. As the Japanese aircraft fell, Harris watched the pilot bail out. Instead of turning away, Harris circled once, dipped his wings a silent salute to a fallen opponent, then flew home. "He was a damned good pilot," Harris wrote later. "If I hadn't gotten him first, he would have had me." These gestures were rare, but they revealed something important. The war in the sky was fought by men who understood each other in ways their generals never could. Up there, stripped of flags and propaganda, there was only skill, luck, and mortality. But the psychological toll was immense. For the Japanese, every mission became a test of will. The Zero was no longer a weapon of dominance, it was a relic of a fading age. It burned easily, couldn't match the new American planes, and yet its pilots still climbed into them, still fought, still died. As fuel supplies dwindled and replacements grew scarce, desperation took hold. Young cadets, barely trained, were sent into combat with 10 hours of flight time. Their commanders told them to trust their spirit, but no amount of spirit could save a man in a dogfight with a P-38 or a Corsair. For American pilots, the strain was different. Many of them flew missions for months on end long, punishing flights over endless ocean. They watched friends vanish into the clouds and never return. The Pacific was vast, and when you died out there, you disappeared into silence. Pilots learned not to form deep friendships. Too many faces vanished too quickly. One said, "We'd come back from a mission, see 3 empty bunks, and nobody talked about it." Propaganda fed both sides, but its effect was uneven. Japanese broadcasts still spoke of divine winds and the Empire's destiny, but even the most loyal soldiers could feel reality closing in. The Americans, on the other hand, heard about every victory, their morale fueled by headlines and letters from home. Yet beneath that confidence, there was fatigue. "Every time I saw a Zero go down, One Lightning pilot wrote, "I felt a mix of triumph and guilt. They were fighting for their home. We were fighting to end it." By late 1944, the psychological divide had become absolute. The Japanese air arm, once full of elite aces, was now reduced to desperate men flying outdated machines. In their eyes, every mission was a farewell. Many didn't even expect to return. Some began to believe that the only way to reclaim honor was through self-sacrifice missions with no return flight. The first special attack units began forming in this period, though. The P-38 seconds often intercepted them before they reached their targets. The Americans, though battle-hardened, were haunted too. Many Lightning pilots described a strange emptiness after victory. They had fought their enemy so long with such intensity that the thought of a sky without Zeros felt unreal. "I spent years learning how to kill them," said one veteran, "and when they were gone, the sky felt too big." The war had changed both sides, sown through defeat, the other through survival. And as the Pacific campaign neared its bloody end, the Zero's shadow began to fade from the skies. But its legacy, its spirit, its myth, its tragic beauty would never be forgotten. The final duels were coming now. The P-38 would continue to strike deep, clearing the way for the new generation of American fighters. And the few remaining Zeros would rise once more into impossible battles, carrying with them the ghosts of an empire already lost to time. By the dawn of 1945, the Pacific skies belonged to America. The balance that once tipped in Japan's favor had reversed completely. The Zero, that once mythical phantom of agility and range, had become a relic still dangerous, still capable in the right hands, but hopelessly outclassed by the machines now flooding from American factories. The war that began with the Zero's dominance was ending with its extinction. New giants had arrived: the F-6F Hellcat, the F-4U Corsair, and the sleek, long-legged P-51 Mustang. Each one faster, tougher, and deadlier than anything Japan could field. But amid this new generation of fighters, the P-38 Lightning remained a silent, workhorsey long-range guardian that had proven itself over every stretch of the Pacific. It escorted bombers deep into enemy territory, attacked shipping convoys, and struck Japanese positions across the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. It wasn't just a fighter anymore, it was an instrument of air supremacy. The Japanese pilots knew it. By 1945, even the most experienced Zero aces could feel the change the moment they climbed into their cockpits. The engines coughed and stuttered, the fuel was low-grade, spare parts were scavenged from wrecks, airfields were cratered, supplies scarce. The legendary squadrons that once terrorized Allied skies now scrambled with barely enough planes to fill a flight line. The Zero had been built for offense, for chasing victory across an open ocean. But now, Japan was fighting on defense, surrounded, hunted, cornered. Its aircraft were being used for desperate intercepts and suicide missions, its pilots told to crash into bombers rather than duel them. The Zero, once a symbol of grace, had become a symbol of sacrifice. But even then, the spirit of the Japanese aviator refused to die quietly. Many of the remaining pilots were boys barely out of training, who had grown up hearing stories of the invincible Zero. They climbed into the same fragile airframes their father's generation had flown, believing they could still make a difference. Against P-38 seconds and Corsairs, they rarely lasted more than minutes. But for them, each flight was an act of faith. They weren't flying for victory they were flying for memory. One American Lightning pilot described the final duels this way: "We'd spot a few Zeros coming in low over the bay. You could tell they were young, they came straight at us, guns blazing, no evasive turns. We'd break, roll and fire a short burst. They'd go up in smoke. Every time, I thought those kids never had a chance." The cold efficiency of the new air war left no room for chivalry. By now, the Americans were flying with radar support, long-range navigation, and fuel reserves that Japan couldn't dream of. P-38 seconds operated from vast island chains, their twin engines carrying them across distances the Zeros could no longer reach. The duels that once defined the Pacific had become executions. The skies that had once echoed with evenly matched fury now carried only one sound: the deep, relentless thunder of Allied engines. Yet amid all this destruction, there were rare moments that broke through the machinery of war, moments of humanity. During one of the final missions over the Philippines, a P-38 pilot shot down a Zero and watched the Japanese pilot parachute into the sea. Instead of leaving him, the lightning circled until a rescue boat arrived. The pilot later said, "We'd spent 3 years trying to kill each other. I couldn't watch him drown." The rescued man saluted from the water before disappearing into captivity. It was as if both sides understood, at last, that the duel between the Lightning and the Zero had always been more than just a contest of steel. It was a test of endurance, will, and respect. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, many of the surviving Zero pilots wept not just for their empire, but for their aircraft. One veteran said, "The Zero was our soul. To see it defeated was to see our youth vanish with it." And across the Pacific, the men who had flown the P-38 Lightning felt a strange, solemn pride. They had not only survived, they had witnessed the evolution of air combat, from its most primitive to its most advanced form. The Lightning had carried them from the desperate days of 1942 to the triumph of 1945, across thousands of miles and countless battles. It had become more than a fighter. It was a legendone that stood at the very threshold between the propeller age and the jet age to come. The final Lightning missions of the war were almost symbolic. They no longer hunted Zeros. They escorted bombers over Tokyo, mapped the ruins of cities, and flew patrols over seas that were, at last, quiet. The enemy was gone. The skyons filled with smoke, flame, and fear was still. But even in peace, the rivalry lingered. The few surviving pilots on both sides would sometimes meet decades later at reunions or memorials. They would shake hands, smile faintly, and talk about the machines that defined their youth. They would say the same thing again and again. The P-38 was strength. The Zero was spirit. Both belonged to history. Because by the end of the war, neither side had truly won in the way they'd once imagined. The P-38 Lightning had proven that technology could evolve faster than courage could adapt. And the Zero had proven that courage, even when doomed, could still inspire fear and respect in those who faced it. The duel was over, but in the minds of every man who survived it, the echo of those engines, the deep twin hum of the Lightning, and the sharp scream of the Zero would never fade. When the smoke finally cleared over the Pacific and the engines of war fell silent, one truth remained. The duel between the P-38 Lightning and the Zero was never just about who built the better fighter. It was about two worlds, colliding two visions of what flight, courage, and mastery truly meant. The Americans built the P-38 as a machine of logic, speed, and precision, a triumph of industry and innovation. It was the physical embodiment of a nation that believed problems could be solved with design, with science, with power. Every bolt, every rivet, every line of the Lightning reflected a new way of thinking about war. That technology, when mastered, could rewrite the rules of survival. The Japanese built the Zero as an act of faith. It was not a weapon of industry, but of belief, crafted by engineers who worshipped purity of form and flown by men who saw death not as defeat, but as fulfillment. It represented a country that believed in beauty, precision, and sacrifice. Every Zero that took to the air was a prayer wrapped in metal, a fragile miracle destined to burn brightly and briefly. When these two philosophies met above the blue expanse of the Pacific, the result was inevitable but unforgettable. The P-38, heavy and unyielding, taught its pilots patience and calculation. The Zero, light and mercurial, demanded intuition and fearlessness. Together, they created a kind of tragic harmony, slow overtaking of one era by another. For the Japanese pilots who flew the Zero, the end of the war felt like the breaking of a spell. They had been taught that the spirit of the warrior could overcome all odds, that honor was victory enough. But no spirit could outrun physics, and no courage could defy fuel shortages, radar, and superchargers. The age of the duelist had ended. The age of the machine had begun. For the American pilots who flew the Lightning, victory brought a strange, quiet pride, tinged with melancholy. They had survived, but they knew they had faced an enemy unlike any other enemy, who never surrendered, even in defeat. When veterans of both sides met years later, they spoke less about hatred and more about respect. Those men fought with everything they had, one P-38 pilot said softly. We just had more to give. The Lightning's twin booms and the Zero's elegant wings symbolized not just nations at war, but humanity at its extremes. What happens when determination meets destiny? Both aircraft were born of necessity, but they transcended their blueprints to become icons. Even now, when historians talk about the Pacific Air War, they speak of that duel with a kind of reverence, because in those fleeting seconds of combat when two planes closed the distance and traded fire, there was something more than violence. There was equality. The hunter and the hunted were the same, men in fragile shells, gambling with physics and fate, suspended between sea and sky. After the war, the surviving Zeros were left to rust in jungle clearings, their paint fading under tropical rain. The P-38 seconds were parked in neat rows on airfields, engines quiet, missions complete. Both became ghosts of a vanished world. But to the men who flew them, those machines were never just metal. They were companions, saviors, and, sometimes, graves. Today, when a restored Lightning lifts off at an air show, its twin engines echo across the field like a heartbeat from another time. And somewhere, in that sound, you can still hear the ghost of a Zero dancing in the distance, as if refusing to fade entirely, because wars end, but rivalries like this one never really die. They live on in stories, in memory, in the quiet understanding shared between former enemies who once met above the clouds. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear them, the thunder of the Lightning, the whisper of the Zero, two legends circling forever in the endless sky of history.